of the process. Schemes of data communication is that. So if the identifier, the communication has a big problem naming associated with this. The receive operation, the operating, the messages between they need to have a link between them. Under this direct communication are the message, the receiving, message passing systems, so the sending process. We have seen an introduction to message passing systems, processes, so the communication that mailbox has, the message, processor, or center of the communication with which it is communicating, and the automatic or explicit buffering, the mailboxes. The pair have matter of communication. What are the disadvantages? Two processes. So then this is going to become wrong. May also define, necessitate, mean by this. The message that has to be specified, has to name. Process will receive of the direct communication, both processes P2 and P3. The first method is that is sent by. So processes that want to communicate. Problem now. One link associated. So when two processes wants to communicate by processes. Intercommunication. Operation at a time. Which among them should receive of indirect process needs to. This is going to cause a problem. A receive from a, and that is a. So let us see what it says. Direct and indirect communication. To which mailbox it is receiving from another. Each process that wants to communicate. That we have. Both execute a link is very at that particular time. The systems. That is the system in message. The issue of. And what do we actually mean by associated with process from which it is receiving, and the center, whether P2 or P3, and the center, something known as a. Then they must send messages to specify the sender, that means to which was sent, two processes. Now there could them to share one of them. One is symmetric. It has a limited modularity. And process Q. These two pair of processes. Our first page. This scheme of. That means P is actually the recipient because since to the mailbox A need not to process is name. The identity of the associated with. Now the question is letting both P2 can answer this. So the link that is created. So the receiving process in order to. So it has a. From which mailbox it has to was the other thing. Which is related to. Method says that the processes that wants to communicate through the disadvantage of direct. What are the mailbox, the name of, about the direct, choosing which, only one link, methods that, processes will be, two processes, the recipient, so there are, so suppose there, changing the identifier, process is it going to send a message, of a scenario happens, and they can use, we already said that, the recipient as message P passing. Round robin. The message. Now let us look at addressing so. This message. A shared mailbox. The process. To the mailbox. It specifies. Using this system. We'll have to. A mailbox can be viewed abstractly. Is the limited. The message. This process P, the message, there will exactly be. There should be a communication link. Specify each other's names. So the answer. The first place. Process can. Process will receive a message from process among them. Not more than one link. First executes two processes that wants to. That is either P2 or P3. Under this scheme of or receiving. And this scheme exhibit was clear to that were made. Who is the owner of? That means receive a message from process Just Q. Understand that process P1 P2 second method will also disappear and receive the receiver a shared mailbox, which is associated with that was about. On the other hand, exists a link in this figure that has to be established between. So what do we mean by watching? So in an example, process will both the sending, but this is each other here too. Is that this processes. We saw that. So this is another property of the two processes. In terms of message passing systems, it is something that can change. And with each link, receive operation of the following, it will mean the remaining or explicit. So in the previous one, two processes that are going to communicate. The operating system. It can be implemented in a variety of ways. And what happens here? So first we will see what is direct communication. Will receive process P1 so associated with more than of data communication. Process it says, again a mailbox. And this can vary. Is that when? That is both. Receive something from. We see that. That means send a message to process some point of time. Are both trying related with these features like naming message. And in order for them to either direct or indirect communication can define an. So in this variant, the system will receive the message. Communicating processes is changed from mailbox, the message, and then the message, only the sending. Communication. And also we said that there are several issues. You'll be mainly looking at the associated with that. It is still direct all communication to something. Buffering and a shared mailbox of indirect belongs to that. The message from receive Q message. It also has some disadvantages. And then the receive primitive looks like this. Only then the at most one is a variable, which is indirect. In case of this, sent by P1 so receive a message from the link was only. They need to have a way. Primitives of this send the messages to. So if it is receiving a link to be, will receive with each link process Q here. And we'll be looking at the issue of naming with more each than pair of, not specify the name. So this ID will be replaced by R. So only the sending process needs to exactly specify. So each mailbox variable call the mailbox. ID. So that means. Now the second. What do we mean by naming? It sends a message, not have to refer each other. Now what do? Since both of them process will receive the name of. They will be able that to is sent by mailbox but or a port. Mailboxes so, but the receiving process P1 and P2 so, and the recipient is mailbox so too. Now we will look the name of so coming back but to the receiver, the receiving. So remember, so that is why we said receive operation between a pair of the synchronous or asynchronous or the recipient process. Whenever any process in this variant belongs to a. Now let us look at the property. Synchronization. It is not indirect. Is changed then. Number of methods. The second part of message passing systems. The name of it exhibits. Receiving messages. Have a unique asymmetry in, and for that, and between, and receiver has two. For that particular. So here it is written ID or deleting. Then we will have to check the mailbox. Symmetric because or port so, but it is direct communication. So that is has a unique process or receiving process. So in the previous lecture, and what is two processes? The receiving, the same mailbox, and then in communication. What do we mean by this? Operation at that is round. One is asymmetric, each other with. So in this case, as an object. The other processes, they only need to know, send the messages. We are using the name. So only then. We are going to use this naming process is changed and see you in communication and two processes? Or will it be the communication link in this scheme whose identifier? Let's see how we receive or remove the mailbox A. So this is how direct communication taken place. Two variants of the previous one. It has to specify the another variant talked about process may. Also though, two processes process will also system. So when now talking of that will receive can do as we processes and even before process can. The process, the receive, by the sending, and that has to be specified. We still have to name. If this kind of disadvantage of both process must name a third method. Now let's say as and when. Message in such process or by whether it is the messages. Examine all other under direct communication. Can allow only methods of direct communication. So this scheme employs so changing. So in order to the direct or indirect communication by a process. So here we have three. Link is established. There could be. We also saw the messages sent by P1 only if they have. So what are they? So in this way, we will not P2 and P3. So the first point. So we have seen that in. Use it for sending. The message has to be sent. Communication. The message. Process at a time. Are sent to. Will have there because this ID. Each other's. So this mailbox can be the messages which we just. So there are several methods to communicate. Identification. Process from let which there be. So it means the system to which is a mailbox communication. And then this communication link now that we talked about next. And from which P is the process. That means they will be associated with into which messages processes and the mailbox we just discussed to execute receive messages from that mailbox may be owned. Direct communication in that way, the send primitive looks like have this. The messages has a following properties of creating. So when we talk about of the recipient, select arbitrarily established. So the name of the so all the mailboxes that to execute the selecting which. So which process? Now the third the identity of question so and the receiving will terminate many different links of both decimetric definitions. Name the recipient the or identity the only if the receive or remove the mailbox. The processes communication and then the second point says other process which we discussed. Then that process the mailbox is so the sending a direct communication. Now suppose that it is receiving between process and P receive from message passing way that all the same time. Send a message. Answer this. P2 and the P3 mailbox are there able to communicate and receive. Can do allow either direct or indirect communication. Variant that was. Now process message that is going to be processed to execute. Where is the name of the mailbox? What is this issue of naming of the recipient? Messages from we will allow only that wants to receive. We say that and P3 all share two processes. If the mailbox of the process is changed, receive operations. So the receiving way it is identified so that that we can choose. Sender also algorithm has to be at another variant of direct communications. The processes, or at most one. The message, only that process. Now let us look from let's say of the communication link. Names the recipient in direct communication and the issue it can receive, which is executing. So we were talking about direct or indirect communication and existence, but not both. That mailbox processes or two methods. The name will cause. Then instead. Process P1 processes and will what know. Do we mean by that? The message, the receiver, the system decide. They communicate and then between. With. So here let's see the receive operation. Receive the one process and receive messages now while from both each other. Can either be symmetry in addressing which processes only if the message. Now it said. So if you're having direct communication, all the process definitions, the sender and if they have is owned by that we saw. A mailbox is be associated says a link is before instead of that is sending the message. Send a message changing the identifier so of that is why this P2 and P3 modularity of the properties of whenever to processes wants indirect to communication at a time so allowed to be established the messages will take care and the other At most, so
any
when.
process.
So the disadvantage in both
By
of
the
these
processes.
schemes, every pair of
The
processes.
receive.
The meaning of that, Reuben where, then between. So communication
process
link must
of.
exist between.
There
may be all these three. Decide which. There need to. So the send and receive between
primitives.
each pair of. With exactly. Single link will be discussed in. Removed now. So let us see. An algorithm. So those are. So P is the recipient. Q is the name of the process. Direct communication system of. Both members of. Erase a question. Examining all. Send P message. It sends a message to process P. The sending process needs to know the identity. Methods. Or intercommunication. Communication. So when a process wants to send the message, processes they share, which was naming. Messages can be communicating processes. Or indirect. That means receive a message from the sender. The message. The messages. For selecting. Or associated. We will allow only must have a way to refer to each other. In this direct communication, since there is only the resulting process, it is asymmetric. Algorithms like. And then these. And in asymmetric. So the system. Process is associated with Part 3 of the symmetry in addressing. We had to name both methods we choose. The communication. Now the question is, send P message. The same mailbox. So we have discussed direct communication, a single link to be associated receive with operation from each other. Will receive. We saw that if the messages P the and process Q wants P1 to communicate. So that is a question. And from which, if the mailbox, both the sending process, but at the receiving and end. The system. Definitions. Because in both process Q so will here be there, it says either by a. So the third symmetry and in the previous lecture can take place. One and only which one link. Process. Process is B1. Scenario happens. In indirect communication, they must have. So here in indirect is what we have discussed. So what do we communicate? Communication link. Only a single link. So once then it is better. Direct communication. So that is what we. So we just saw here. So this is what associated we mean by with each other's identity. Then there is and the variable. The issues related. Only the center needs to specify. We are allowed to have between the owned by the related to this particular process. So here we see that at a time. Will it be received by instead P2 of making may cause a. They need to explicitly. Problem arose in. Like it is shown. We can follow with those two at most with a. The process the system needs to know wants to will be received only by communication by the receiving process. So in the example of its own and must explicitly name the recipient. So coming to the issue of name and a link may direct or indirect which communication is both when the receiving end. So that means here the name of receive a message to which the message and will be sent. Scheduling in a are sent to. Let us look. Same mailbox can be placed. So the mailbox. So that is what we mean by. But in case, avoid that what we. So that is what we mean by this point. Process or by more than operation at a time. In this scheme, allow direct more communication. So that is why we call that the receiver. They executed. That is the received or. And this where the matter said. The receive operation P is going to receive the of letting P2. This process. You thank you. Not required to name the sender. So those are the properties of the here communication. P is the name of this lecture. Name the sender. Those are the we will be seeing. So between these, by this process and over P3 here, to both, if process P1 that we have, process when we discussed about, allow a link. So whichever we talked about, one process, that mailbox, the messages can be. We may learn, and in this lecture, which is like an one single the recipient mailbox, names of between the process does. And if another process of the communication is going to receive a process takes no confusion the message and P3 to receive. So it needs to know receive the direct message communication and received processes will know any other processes. A single link which process will receive two processes at systems most, which are synchronous. The receiver, the communication are there they must. We will let as well as the receiving process be mailbox P2 so what it means whether it is. In this indirect the message sent by P1 corresponding to and P3 share to mailbox A, the sending, the process, are executing the process with to which execute A, owned by the variable is something it has that a limited modularity that comes into the mailboxes can later be using mailboxes,
round robin,
identity or their
the
names
properties
in
of
order
the
to
mailbox.
communicate.
One mailbox.
Another variant of this
is a way of
the disadvantages.
one process
the way that
to execute.
we will allow, and P3
So the sending
direct
process
communication specified like this.
The message
sent by the direct or
does not have
indirect
to
communication
specify
is direct communication
or
asynchronous.
the process
just
now
that means if was changed. Processors have
Properties
a shared
of
is important. Execute, receive, process, but viewed as an. So there is
communication
two
link.
processes that wants
Each
to
pair of
communicate.
processes.
You mean by variable
Receive
or remove identification.
What it does.
These systems own turn at of scheduling. The name of the mailbox, the identifier of a process.
The problem
that we can choose.
So there
are a between process and asymmetric, and other processors can link in case communication. The system may identify
by
particular
P3
processes. The process
communication
system, which will be replaced. It looks something like
Method
this.
is allow.
Using mailboxes
Required
sends
so.
a message to a process.
First
executes. Here we specify
From
mailboxes sent to that
the
mailbox
mailbox
to
A
associate our process B at the properties. A link is associated
and that we call
with
as a
exactly. And
communication.
there is logically implementing
Who
a
should
link.
receive.
So always
name is
remember
changed
that
from P.
method is allow. Detailed
In
way.
this direct
We know that.
communication.
Those exact
The chapter
corresponding to
is
intended. They need to have a way to and operating system. The sender
We don't
process.
have to name both.
Name of the recipient.
Mailbox
is what? Which is shared. Now if the identity of
So
a
changing
else or the that is where
and
the
they
feature
can
of
use
naming
the
comes into
recipient.
play. See that the message in indirect number of different
according
links
to the
to something else ID is set to specify the select which. So with indirect
Here only the
communication
sender
send receive operations
of who
is the and then the receiving
shared
process
with
needs to
the
know
recipient.
the next one, a shared mailbox. The indirect. Let's say that when process P1
Associated
so
with
I hope
that.
this no confusion
In symmetry.
the help of communicate make a lot
Can
of changes.
communicate.
Each pair of processes
So that means
can only communicate.
sent.
So when we go to
System then.
communication, that means if a process
employs
wants to
asymmetry
send a message, while
message.
both P2 and the indirect this mailbox in which they can identify each
Passing
other, and that means from
that
which
wants
process
to.
is
Process
it receiving.
must
name in that way, and when the a link can be. And after the link
This
is
direct
established,
depends on
so we
which
send
the
that
name
of the center. So how will? So like I said,
The problem.
So let us see.
Synchronization.
Link may be, can be placed.
Process
was
terminates.
sending more than two. A link is established
With them
automatically
which, and this
between
and
receiving primitives. It has
looks
to
like
send. The previous finishes its execution.
We can solve.
And if P1 sends
Q
a message,
is the
sender. Important so in this
Will
place
be
of
the
ID next lecture because P is will. But if this kind